A fox knows many things, but a hedgehog knows one important thing. It's one important thing. It's one important thing.
Welcome to the Spiritual Hedgehog podcast, where we explore the role philosophy and faith play in your daily life. Here are your hosts, Ira Gardner and Pastor Eric Dahl.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to part 2 of my conversation with Eric about enlightenment, or also known as emotional well-being. Again, please forgive the audio quality. We had some profound radio interference that I've attempted to filter out as much as possible. But we just thought this is such an important conversation that we went ahead and shared the video anyway. So thank you for being here, and I hope you enjoy the conversation.
So the next category is this idea of the changes in our perception, meaning that we increase our focus on the present. This gets to be similar to the work of Eckhart Tolle, this idea of just being aware of all of our senses, not just what we see, but what we experience, we feel. It can become part of a meditation practice, but it's also that when we have all these elements in combination, reduced thoughts, reduced emotional drama, a reduced sense of self-consciousness and self-awareness, that allows us to be more fluid and more aware of all the things happening, that allows us to just experience a greater active participation in the world. And what's interesting about all these categories is well-being doesn't say that you don't have, like, you're not this, the stereotypical monk, hermit monk up on a mountain, living this kind of passive life. It's this idea that you return to your stable state much more rapidly. You're still going to have emotions. It's not you're going to be without emotion, but you're going to be more aware. You're going to have greater perception, and you're going to be less triggered. And if you have been triggered, you'll return back to a harmonious stasis in your life much faster.
Well, so I guess the way I would relate to that personally right now is thinking about, I know in the past, granted, the last time I really moved was probably 25 years ago. And I remember how stressful of time that was, and how, everything's new and had to figure everything out, right then, right at that time, and just so hyper aware. And this time, I think one of the steps I made, and I told you this earlier, is first of all, I wanted to say goodbye well, and jump into my next call, even though there were starting to be emails coming in, and there were a couple things I had to respond to real quickly, but to be some of that perception stuff, to me, it has to do with how you can just be present in what you're doing. And then into the move, I told you early on in this, as we were just kind of getting to know one another again after a few weeks off of this, that my senses have just been hyper aware. I'm sleeping better, and then I wake up refreshed and ready for another day. And what I guess what I'm saying about that is even the fights that I might have with Katie, or when you start to bicker about where something goes, or kind of those conversations that you have, I think both of us just sort of recover quicker.
Yeah.
And it's like, you can kind of place it for where it is, and trying to just and take note of, it was an interesting reaction to that, and then you go about your day. And instead, what I used to do is beat myself up, for a response that was out of line or out of character. I'll still apologize, but which I think is important. But I was always tended to be one of those over apologetic people, and would want to make sure they really understood that, that I was sorry, or that I did that wrong, or whatever it is. And I think now it's almost a graciousness that I hope I extend outward. But the other thing I had to do is extend that graciousness inward as well, to say, it's okay, Don't have to figure that out. You didn't have to do that perfectly. No, you didn't understand all the dynamics in that conversation. It's okay. Yeah.
Well, I like the idea of your thinking about the fact that when you move to a new place or when you go on vacation to a new place, that you've got your heightened senses, and as a photographer, it's very easy to be addicted to that sense of awareness, and I always tell my students that um, it's easier to photograph in the exotic location because there's a newness to it that makes you totally aware. The challenge as you grow your career is to keep that in your familiar places, and that you can actually grow deeper understanding if you can maintain that awareness, and you can make even more profound photographs in your own backyard if you can have this heightened sense of perception.
Interesting. Yeah. So how does that work with me needing my my couch and my 2 chairs to be back in my living room so I can have that place where I can rest and just see that I still have a familiar place to come back to. How do I heighten, how do I see the colors, I suppose, differently in the chairs or as I step into the backyard and have certain things that I've put out there that remind me of where I've come from. But how do I see those things differently? Is that what you're talking about, or is there more?
Well,
I mean, a little flippant there, but
no. What's interesting about that is what you brought up is dealing with symbolic perception. For example, I can look in the background behind you and see a painting of Colin Kaepernick. I mean, Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
And it's loaded with symbolic meaning.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But to raise my awareness, instead of me focusing on the meaning of the symbol of Jesus, and maybe even focusing on the meaning of a dark-skinned Jesus, which I love, I can focus on the diagonal lines of purple, green, and yellow, and the circle, and just focus on perceiving and feeling the experience of the color, that it's having a psychological energy, transmitting energy to me with these radiating color lines. And so rather than being focused on this symbolic of, oh, that's my favorite couch, I can be focused on the bigger idea of, oh, there's something here for me to sit on to give me a relief from standing.
Nice.
And when you talked about you're waiting for your couch to be in there, I thought, but you know what? You could have nothing but a yoga mat and a pillow and be completely content.
Yep. No,
and just to be aware of the light and the smells and all these things. So, yeah, and ultimately, with Dr. Martin, everything we're talking about is really talking about moving away from a narrative sense of self, moving away from a symbolic sense of the world into the non-symbolic perception of the world. It is those non-symbolic moments. And I will tell you, I actually wrote about it last week in my blog. I was going through some photos and I was just struck by this one image of a cloud study. And it took me immediately back to being in the Florida Keys at sunset at a very dark point in my life where that sunset, the sky, something erupted to where all of a sudden all anxiety, all emotional pain was gone. It was that aha, right? It's that God moment. And in fact, I see it over and over. Why do people want to live by water? Well, probably because those sunsets are so powerful that it stops everybody to look and go, ah. And it's that experiencing that ah more frequently in our life and finding ways to connect with our perceptions that allow us to have that non-symbolic experience. And that's really, and in fact, Dr. Martin talks about well-being is the result of a persistent non-symbolic experience. And his definition of persistent is somebody able to experience a non-symbolic sense of self, this greater well-being for a period of over a year at a time. That you can just see it change over time to where it just evolves to where, the worst place for our dissatisfaction in our life right now in the United States is the narrative structure around the upcoming presidential election. It is the polemics of politics in this country has stimulated so much angst, anxiety, anger, protests, marches, people showing up, joining militias and bearing arms, which goes so far away from helping and being concerned about the well-being of others. It's living in this fear tied to a narrative story. And so Dr. Martin would argue that our well-being comes from having a greater number of non-symbolic experiences, having a persistent non-symbolic experience that allows us to reduce the emotional angst, reduce the number of thoughts that are perseverating about ourselves, feel a greater sense of connection to an expansiveness rather than a contraction of fear of not having enough, and being able to just recognize how amazing every day, every moment of our life can be.
So I guess one of the curiosities that brings to me is, what about folks? Does sentimentality play a place in that? I mean, would you see sentimentality as symbolic? I know we've got to be careful there, because there's also certain people are wired, I think, a little bit more towards sentimentality, or the objects. It's the person that can't get rid of anything, because it ties them to a story, to the past. So there's a grounding in the healthy aspect of that. But do you have a sense of where Dr. Martin would say that becomes unhealthy?
One of the descriptors, one of the concepts is this idea of non-dual awareness. And so what you've just described is a duality. Do I want to strive for an extreme in one direction of non-narrative, non-symbolic experiences, and to wipe away the positive memories, the sentimental memories, or even the wisdom learned from the dark memories? Or the other extreme is I want to hold on to the narrative identity. And this is where we get back to Kierkegaard, that basically is saying that despair is caused by the fact that our self identity is nothing more than a borrowed sense of self that is a necessary to operate within the context of our life at a particular moment, and that existential crisis happens when that borrowed sense of self is no longer in alignment with our life circumstances. And so thinking back of, what it means to become a responsible adult and having to shed the identity of I'm the child and I get all my needs taken care of by outside from others, to becoming the adult where I take care of myself, to become the adult with family where I take care of myself and others, and then go beyond that expansive and take care of the community. So I'm going to say that the Dr. Martin and myself included would say that I would adopt a non-dual, which says it's not one or the other, yes, but it's having the mental well-being to selectively choose or to go fluidly in and out of sentimentality. Too much sentiment becomes pain and suffering. Buddhism talks about this, the idea of holding on to things as suffering. So for example, for me, I had this beautiful 1958 Buick car that I held on to over 30 years. But by the end of it, it caused me nothing but pain because I didn't have the money to do a full restoration of it. I didn't have the money to build a large enough garage to put it in. So it was sitting out in my yard, rusting, deteriorating. And what had been this really wonderful positive thing became this really negative thing. And it wasn't until I was willing to let go of sentimentality and sell it that I was able to move on to a BMW convertible that just brings me incredible joy, and it's small enough to fit in, you know. But
yeah, good.
So yes, I had this thing that I held on to for sentimental reasons, but when you hold on to it for too long, then it's time to let go. And I think there's a fluidness of mental well-being that says, it doesn't pain me to let it go. And in fact, I felt the joy of the person I sold it to was so excited to have it that the person that bought it had a complete shop with a dugout to where he could stand underneath to repair it. He was going to do a frame up restoration. It was like the best possible outcome for this sentimental object to be gifted, upcycled to somebody that really was in a better position to enjoy it. Brought me no pain. But if I were stuck on the sentimental, then I would be stuck in a position of emotional pain. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. That's nice way of explaining that. It shows, even as much as I will talk about dualism, I will still set up those systems. We're so set up in, it's either good or it's evil. It's either right or it's wrong. If it's really, instead of, being able to put some perspective on it. So that was helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. We're human, and we're going to be wired towards certain facets of the spectrum of being. It's just when we become aware, when we become conscious of it causing pain, emotional pain, then we need to be willing to let that go for the sake of greater emotional well-being. And it becomes easier and easier to navigate the challenges. And this is why I'm so committed to this podcast, because really you're talking about a whole spectrum of things that go into letting go and making choices. It becomes this philosophical framework for your life that you apply, that maybe it works now really well, and bam, wife has a car accident at the top of the driveway. That changed her life. That changed our life. Now, what was this harmonious life pre-existing to that may get disrupted, and it may cause us to do something different. We may end up having to, buy a car. We might have a car payment now. The insurance may not cover everything, or oh well. I'm better situated to deal with that from a position of mental flexibility that comes from a greater sense of well-being through various ways that I've developed that in my life. So here's an interesting one for you. Mental well-being comes at the price of having less memory.
Man, I've been sitting that way for a long time. My predecessor at St. Mark's, Dick Finch, he and I used to always joke out neither of us had a good memory. So, I mean, but yeah, that's I'm curious about that though. We would talk a lot about memory as well, and talk about our experience of memory is, it's not the actual memory anywhere. It's a memory of a memory of a memory, a lot of times, which, you just, I'm curious how that works. So how have you seen that playing out for you?
Well, for example, when I have gone to a class reunion or family gathering, I will have people tell these wonderful stories that I have to say to myself, gosh, I don't even remember that. And what's interesting is I've grown very comfortable with that, because I look at that and go, you know what, I'm not tethered to that, or I've moved beyond that. And what's interesting is emotional well-being does trigger some memory loss, but what's interesting is it doesn't trigger the loss of specific facts. It just like that stuff is still there if I needed it. And for example, I'll give you a really interesting experience I had. So my parents moved me to Spokane, Washington from San Pedro, California, which is it's LA. It's right down by the port of LA. And I lived there till I was 9 years old. And I've been visiting there annually since I was about 16. But every time I would go down there, I would be completely lost. I'd be fine, I'd be happy, and I'd always kind of find my way around, but I would be just kind of like, I didn't have strong memory of it for a variety of reasons. Finally, after many, many years, I decided that I needed to go do a photographic project of documenting my childhood neighborhood photographically with film. And I took my son with me. And what was so profound is that I knew that city like the back of my hand. I took my son everywhere. I never had to look at a map. I never had to use Google Drive. Like, I had a intention that caused me to need to remember where things were spatially, how to get there, because I had specific photographs that I wanted to make. And so it was there. Year later, I go back, visit family. I'm not there for any particular strong reason. I was back to I couldn't remember anything. And so the idea there is that we have some loss of memory because we don't need it on instant stand. You know, it's there. It's not lost. I don't need to perseverate over those memories. I don't need to spend all my time living in the past. How much emotional anxiety is created by the human being's unique ability to think about the past and think about the future, worry about the future, lament over the past. Those two extremes of past and future tend to bring a lot of people unhappiness. And so if I can let those go, I'm going to have less memories, but I'm going to be able to move fluidly with ease to when I need it, it's there.
No, I think that journey is interesting of thinking about if we do not tether ourselves either to the past or to the future, we are going to be better off. And where do we see that? I think I see that the most again. I have a brother going through a divorce right now. It's been a very, very painful process. I think that's why that's very forefront, but in my thinking right now. But looking at the traps that happen of either bitterness towards the past of something that's happened, or who's going to get something in the future that I may not have, instead of again looking at the joys of what's right there, what's right in front of you, and instead of trying to win something, again back to that language, or to try to show mastery of something, or to try to, which they all again have their good aspects, or not all of them, but have their good aspects to them. Instead of just being present, to say the more you can just be present with your kids that are there, with your friends that are around, and present with yourself, and to say there is still so much that is good even in the midst of some very hard stuff that's going on. It's not an easy place to get to, but I think I think you may be onto something here.
Well, I just think of the metaphor of the world's not black and white; it's shades of gray,
Yep.
and learning to be okay with the gray.
Yep, for sure.
Well, so my last category that Dr. Martin talks about in his research is this idea of a slight decrease in a sense of agency. And agency is this idea of that we can be active choosers, active participants. We can, it's the American dream that says if I just work hard and set my goals, I can achieve everything in my dreams. And what happens is that actually a lot of people, that's top-down thinking, that's goal-oriented thinking, and a lot of people can get fixated on the goal and become very unhappy. And again, research shows that there's only so much income above your minimum needs being met that generates real happiness, right? And so a decreased sense of agency comes about with this experience of, life is kind of unfolding the way it needs to, and I can just kind of go with the flow. You see a lot of that with Taoism. The philosophy of Taoism is learning to go with the flow. You hear all these little axioms of truth and wisdom that we hear, going with the flow, and and it's about the process, it's about the journey, not the destination. Like, we know these nuggets of wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, can we raise it to an awareness to where we can actually apply it in our lives, by just learning to be a little more harmonious and a little not so reactive, but responsive.
Case in point, right now we are. It's one of the things I'm looking at as we're looking at race relations and how, and you know, so many things happen in culture that make you, oh, isn't that terrible, you know, and the reaction, and then the reaction is we got to do something right now, instead of being in a place where you can be responsive to say, you know, this is as horrible as something may be. We don't need to just react to it. We can respond within our best selves, and to understand that our best selves can be tapped even in the midst of some very difficult times. So I think that question of between reactiveness and responsiveness is one that really excites me, because I think it's more and more where I find myself playing with my own thinking. Is, you know, I want to be responsive, but I don't want to just be reacting to whatever's happening, because there's too much. I mean, in some ways, if we're trying to, you know, react to everything that's happening, it gets to be too much. But if we're looking to be responsive from where we find our core, where we find our center, where we find our place of well-being, it helps us to realize that, you know, and I think nature teaches us that more than anything, is there are regenerative properties that can happen. And if I don't get to that thing today, it's okay. This is where I'm feeling respond today. And yes, but it's, I would love to tell you, I've got that one all figured out, Ira, but it's that's the wrestling, like, okay, you're acting again, Eric, and that's the conversation that I've been having with myself more lately, is to say, are you being reactive or are you being responsive? And I don't always have that answer, but I think I'm hopefully getting better at that, in the sense of how I respond. I would guess as a teacher, you're having to play with that all the time as students come to you, is how do you not react to the student, but how do you respond in ways that make sense?
That's been an important part of my maturation process as an educator. I was not good at that early in my career. And, you know, that's where I value the fact that in any environment, whether it's work, home, diversity is really beneficial, because, for example, where I work at the community college, I've grown to really appreciate the ratio of experienced faculty who've been there 30, 40 years, and faculty that are just starting out and somewhere in between, and that you need an ecology that has these dialogues of wisdom happening, because, you know, the 30 or 40 year teacher is going to need to learn some new technology, new things, new ideas, and adapt to changing student demographics. On the other hand, the faculty that's just starting out, that's really adept at this level, needs that wisdom passed on of the greater understanding of being able to work with ease and respond to students rather than reacting. And you know, not everything needs to move at 100,000 miles an hour. That we, you know, and that grounding of process that leads to a successful outcome.
Yeah, yeah, and that's right, and because that's what we're looking for a lot of times, is that, in a sense, that successful outcome, that, you know, yeah, it sometimes, if you're just reacting, you know, yes, you can get the next thing put in place, but there's no grounding to it, and take a step back. So I'll let you know in 10 years how I'm doing with that. But I every once in a while, I really still catch myself with that. You know, somebody wants to leave a group, or somebody wants to, you know, kind of comes up with the next great idea because of I think a place to talk about it is in the race conversation. We've got to be in this for the long term, because if we're not into it for the long haul, are reacting to the death of George Floyd isn't you know isn't going to sustain anything. It's not going to lead to any change. But if we want to respond to say this is really a series of a number of things, how are we going to respond? And I think there is some responding going on that's going to be very helpful moving forward. So
I'm optimistic.
I
I'm
am too.
optimistic.
I am too. Yeah.
So the last thing I want to talk about today is what are steps that we can take to acquire overall emotional well-being or enlightenment, as we've historically called it. Particularly in America, we have the transcendentalist and this idea of the enlightenment. The works of Thoreau and Emerson, and just this particularly American form of transcendence through nature and wildness and that sort of thing. And I do think that spending time out in wilderness, out in nature, very much helps people experience a greater sense of well-being. And so I'm always going to try to support ways to increase green space in my life, in our communities, parks. We're blessed in Spokane to have such an abundance of green space, but it's something that we need to be aware of so we can protect it. But there are steps. They're not a recipe. There's not a single file direct path to enlightenment. It is about finding what works for each of us. And so there's a process to acquiring well-being. There is not a specific path. It's a process. And so there is basically two categories of techniques or strategies to achieve enlightenment or well-being. The first category is what we talk about as in the mind techniques. This is where we are addressing that narrative ego, that narrative sense of self directly. And so those in the mind techniques can include going to counseling, cognitive behavior therapy, particularly if somebody is dealing with a despair associated with addiction or trauma or PTSD. We need to address that from a narrative in the mind technique approach. Also, interestingly enough, a lot of people achieve their sense of well-being as the result of having gone through a transformational loss that leads to them becoming aware of their despair and becoming able to let go and gain that sense of well-being. And so for some people, they have just, they reach rock bottom. And when you reach rock bottom, there's only one way to go, right? And that's up to a state of well-being. So that's a very hard method to go. And that's for people that have gone through some pretty extreme life events. For the rest of us, the many that fit in the middle of average, there's going to be some in the mind techniques that might start with cognitive behavior therapy, or a lot of positive psychology, which is where I'll have a link to, there's like over 50 positive psychology strategies that we can embed in our life. And you don't have to do all 50, but you can experiment and find the ones that make sense for you. For some people, the positive psychology might come through a journaling strategy, a gratitude journal, which has been shown to have huge, profound mental health, positive mental health benefits that far outlast the act of journaling. You could quit after 7 weeks and you would have a over 6 months worth of mental health well-being experience in your life.
Yeah.
So a lot of positive psychology is related to developing positive habits. And I think that gets back to what you were talking about, positive addiction. I think there's a difference between a positive addiction and a positive habit. Because I think a habit is something you do, but it's not as regimented or rigid. You're not going to suffer if it doesn't happen that day or it gets interrupted, so to speak. The second category are what we call on the mind techniques, which can positively impact the in the mind thinking, because in the mind is dealing with our thoughts and what we think about our lives and ourselves and that sort of thing, or what we think about others and our place within the world. On the mind technique is not focused so much on us, but rather an awareness centered practice. It might be just getting into a walking meditation of just going out and being in nature. It might be a meditation practice, but the difference is a lot of meditation practices use guided imagery. So instead of focusing on ourselves or our past or our problems, we're guided towards just this hyper awareness of how wonderful we are in the world right this moment. And so any sort of mindfulness-based practice that might include meditation, might include yoga, might include journaling, any number of things can go in there. And this is where faith, a prayer practice, when we pray, we have the opportunity to create a vision of harmony and happiness and to pray for well-being. And this is one of the interesting things I got from my recent conversation with Pastor Edwin that goes along with the faith practice, and that's the role of ritual. And ritual can give us the words when we can't really formulate the words ourselves. And I think that can be an on-the-mind technique, that I can use the ritual of praying the Nicene prayer or the creed or just any number of prayers that have maybe been passed down to your family. And one of my favorites is just it tends to come up in the fall and winter time. I get very excited about the liturgy of the hours and the different prayers for different times of day, and that our faith practice can really help us move away from the narrative self and towards a spiritual enlightenment.
One of the things that, as you said, this isn't as prescriptive. It's finding that language that's going to work for you. So when I talk about prayer to folks, I think, for some, my dad getting down on his knees before he'd go to bed, that sort of ritual worked for him.
Yep.
For me, if I'm on a walk or if I'm running or if I'm bike riding, my prayer life is a lot better because I like the activeness that. But for others, listening to music or playing music can be a very prayerful. All of those things that move us again to see what is of value right here, right now, and what is good, in our midst. I think are all ways of thinking about the positive positions of prayer and positive ways of prayer. So yeah.
Another technique is through curiosity, through learning, being actively engaged in learning new things and not being stuck in the rut of this is my life and this is all I know and this is all I care to know. Curiosity, for me, having a ritual of listening to podcasts has been really helpful to my overall well-being. And so it's about finding the right combination through trial and error and paying attention. It's just paying attention. Is this working for me? And not being dogmatic about it to the point where what works initially may not work in the long term because you're going to change over time and your life needs are going to change over time. And so you need to evolve with it. And I think that's one of the things I love is the fact that as I become aware of my own spiritual circadian rhythm, I return to different activities at different seasons of the year, and I return to different regimens in my life at different times of year as well. And learning to just find what is harmonious for me. What's your own farmer's almanac, so to speak?
Yeah, that's nice. That's a nice way to put it, because I think all of those things, and I like I like two things that you said: trial and error, because you don't, and we need to have trial and error all our lives, and curiosity. I had a counselor, a pastoral counselor actually, that I saw, and in the midst of seeing him, one of the things that happened was we were talking about conflict, and you said the best way I've learned to deal with conflict is just through curiosity, to get very curious about what's happening with the other person, what they're thinking about, and what's going on. And so curiosity is a word that I think we all need to hold on to. And when things are going south, the more curious we can get about what's going on here, and allow, but without turning that into a system either, right? It's just beneficial.
Well, so wisdom, one of the definitions of wisdom is the ability to remain curious in the face of adversity. Wisdom comes from that self-reflection of what can I learn from this adverse experience? And conflict is the adversity that gives us the opportunity to gain wisdom.
Nice. I think that's a good place to wrap up for us today.
I think so too.
Well, thanks, Ira. I really appreciate our time together. And,
me too. I'm glad we're able to get back together, and I'm glad you're safely relocated to Eugene, and I'm excited for you. And have a great week.
Absolutely, you too.
Thank you for joining us today on The Spiritual Hedgehog. For show notes and more information, go to www.thespiritualhedgehog.com.